Okay, so next we want to talk about what's called a production function. Um, so basically, every firm, I don't care whether they've read an economics textbook, whether they've ever heard of economics, uh, whether they know they're making a production decision or not, every firm has to make a decision on how much they're going to produce in a given year or given time period. Okay, every firm. Um, so what economists have kind of come up with is this idea of the production function, and what that is, it's a way of mapping graphically and mathematically different inputs to your output. Okay, so um, it's basically a function like a mathematical f of x um, with your inputs as the x's. So typically economists like to think of your inputs as being like capital, labor, land, or technology. Um, I think innovation might be one of the ones that your book mentioned, which would be another way of saying technology. But capital, labor, land, innovation, or technology are typically the general categories of input. And if you're looking at different markets, you might specify something more specific. So if you're looking at the market for McDonald's, it might be French fries and workers, okay, or labor hours, or ovens and labor hours, or whatever, deep fryers and labor hours. Those could be your inputs, and they'll map to your output, which is the number of Happy Meals you produce. Okay, so a production function would take the, let's say, it'll map the output for Happy Meals to the inputs of deep fryers and hours worked. So if your hours worked went from 11 to 12 and your deep fryer stayed the same, you should see an increase in your output. And that's what a production function will do. It'll map using a function the input to the output. Okay. So one of the ones that is kind of popular with economists is what's called the Cobb-Douglas production function. Um, but you don't need to know what that is, but it looks like this. It's some capital, some labor, and they're raised to an exponent. Um, and it kind of has these nice properties, which we'll talk about in like a bullet point or two. But basically, the reason I have this Cobb-Douglas production function here is that uh, it's just to show you what it means to have a production function. So you have a function, right? It's some math. F is your function, right? It's your unit of output as a function of capital and labor, which are your two input variables. Okay. And, depending on the value of K and the value of L, you're going to get a value of F, which will tell you how many units you're able to produce. Okay. Right. So we call marginal product the additional quantity of output produced by using one more unit of input. Okay. So your marginal product, like any marginal variable, right? Remember, marginal means the next additional unit. Your marginal product is the additional output from the next additional unit of capital or the next additional unit of labor. Okay, so if you wanted to find what your marginal product of capital is, going from 1 to 2. So let me keep this up. Your marginal product of capital going from 1 to 2. What you would do is you'd plug in 1 for capital, okay, and then you'd find F. And then you'd plug in 2 for capital, and then you'd find F. And you subtract the F of when K is 2 from the F when K equals 1. That'll be your marginal product of capital going from 1 unit to 2 units. Okay. So it's the additional output that's generated from one additional unit of input. Okay. And if we're being technical, and you don't need to know this, but for those of you who are interested in taking economics 2 or microecon in the future, what you would technically do is you would derive this, if you know what that means, and that'll get you the instantaneous rate of change. And that's really what marginal product is. But for the sake of this course, we're just going to do what's called discrete, which is just going from 1 unit to 2 units, not 1 to 1.00001. Okay. Anyway, so marginal product is the additional output from generated from additional input. Okay. And most production functions that we generate, or most production functions that economists tend to use, um, tend to have what's called diminishing marginal product, and that's built in. That's an assumption that economists make. It's an abstraction. Um, it's not always going to be the case, but it tends to hold in the real world. So economists tend to use it when they're doing their analyses. And basically, diminishing marginal product, just like diminishing marginal utility from consumer theory, is the idea that as you increase, the units of capital, right, from like 0 to 1 million, your marginal product will go from like really high to close to 0. Okay. Um, or it could be any input. It doesn't have to be capital. But basically, as you increase your inputs, the marginal product will decrease. Okay. Total product will still keep increasing, but it will increase at a slower rate. Okay. And it tends to look a little bit like this. So this is your total product, is your production function. Okay. So you have your quantity of your output as a function of your quantity of inputs. And this is just one input. This is just labor. Because you don't want a 3D graph. It'll be more complicated than we need for this course. But notice that the output is increasing for every unit of labor, but it's increasing at a slower rate. It bends, right? It starts to curve down. It's never going to decrease, right? But it's going to increase, and the more it increases, the flatter this line is going to get. Okay. So here's your marginal product of labor. Basically, this is the slope of the production function at every point. Okay, and notice it's decreasing and it's going to 0. Like the more and more and more labor you use, the closer and closer to 0 your marginal product of labor will be. Okay, that's your diminishing marginal product. And I don't want to harp on this too much because we've seen this with diminishing marginal utility now, I think 2 or 3 times, and this is just the same pattern, and you'll see it again, I'm sure, in your later econ classes if you decide to take them. Diminishing marginal whatever, diminishing marginal x is like just a thing in economics, so it tends to happen. Um, Again, it's not always going to be the case, but it is a standard assumption for a reason. Um, so, it's important. But going back, that's why economists like this Cobb-Douglas function, which we tend to use a lot, because it does have this diminishing marginal product property to it. Yeah, so that's the production function. Again, it's just a map between your input, in this case labor, and your output, whatever the good you're producing is. So how much, like if your labor is at this point, there's your output. It's just a map. Okay, nothing too complex. All right.